Sorry, folks. Yeah, my mic was muted. There we go. Well, again, as I said, I'm glad you're here today. This is Christianity in the Hot Seat. This is a 10-week series that we're going to do dealing with the tough issues of Christianity. And let me just say that, again, I'm excited that everyone's here. We're going to be dealing with some of the most difficult questions that Christians may face. And I think it's an important thing. Now, I didn't plan on this class being a live video feed initially. It was going to be taught like I've done before at our church with a live crowd, things like that. However, coronavirus did change all of that. So now I get to do it via video. And that's great because I've gotten emails from people in other parts of the world, even South Africa and London and other places, that were trying to do the math in order to figure out what the time difference was so maybe they could tune in, things like that. These will be archived. All of these classes will be archived. I'll leave the classes up for about a week and then it'll be replaced by the new one. But if you've registered for the class, then you'll be able to go back and watch the entire archive like for the next 3 months. It's one of the things that we do. If you haven't registered for the classes yet, please do so. Go to comereason.org/dare to defend, comereason.org/dare to defend, and just put your name and your email address down. And that'll give you access to not only the recordings, but class notes, the PowerPoint slides I'm going to be putting up there. All of those kinds of things will be available to you. So I'm excited, though, for this specific event. And our first question that we're going to tackle today is the Bible versus other faiths, which is from God? And I think that's a pretty good question because I've dealt with a lot of folks who said, how do you know that Christianity is the right way? There's so many different faiths out there. There's so many different religious books, belief systems. How can we tell what's the proper one? What's the right one, so to speak? So that's what I wanted to kind of tackle initially, and then we'll get into, as the weeks progress, other questions, other ideas. Now, one of the things that I wanted to just make a point of is the fact that our starting points matter. See, because our assumptions color our understanding. And that's something that's really important for us to remember in all of this. I remember hearing a story of kids who were returning to school, first day of school. And each of the children's, young kids, first, second grade, brought gifts for their teacher. And, the supermarket's manager showed up. And the daughter of the supermarket manager brought the teacher a nice basket of assorted fruit, and the teacher was very excited about that. The florist's son, of course, showed up and brought the teacher a nice bouquet of flowers. Candy store owner's daughter gave the teacher a pretty box of candy. Teacher was very grateful for that. And then the teacher looked and saw that the liquor store's owner was carrying a big box, but it was dripping a little bit. Now, teacher got a little excited. She touched the drop of the liquid with her finger, tasted it, and she said, "Is it wine?" "No," the boy replied. She said, "Well, taste it again. Is it champagne?" "No," said the little boy. "It's a puppy." Yeah. Sometimes it does matter what we assume, doesn't it? Because our starting point can make a difference. And that's one of the things that I do want to talk to you about today. And that's true with a lot of things. Now, this is a picture of George Washington. Of course, George Washington, father of our country. He was an amazing individual. He was very intelligent. Matter of fact, much of what the U.S. presidency developed into was a result of Washington. He died December 14th, 1799, became sick after working out in the rain and snow, but he was always one for punctuality. And rather than changing out of his wet clothes, he decided to dine, have dinner while he was still kind of soaking wet. Now, his wife Martha had been sick previously with a cold. My guess is that's probably where he caught his infection, but it eventually proved fatal to him. The interesting thing, though, is one of his first remedies, one of his first approaches to becoming well again was to call in someone to do a little bloodletting on him. Now, you think we're almost in the year 1800 and bloodletting is still going on. How could the father of the United States, somebody with that much insight, be interested in bloodletting? Why would that be a thing, right? But see, bloodletting has been a thing for quite a long time. And it really, I know today we look at bloodletting and we think it's ridiculous, right? There was an old Steve Martin sketch with Theodoric of York, medieval barber, and he was out bleeding people here and there. And how can you even think that something like draining people's bloods would make a difference? Well, you have to put your mind in the position of those of earlier eras. So a lot of people didn't have much experience with biology throughout the ages, but most people did have a lot of experience growing crops. They knew agriculture because it was how they ate every day. You may get sick once or twice a year. You have to eat 3 meals a day. You have to give it to your family. It was an important thing. And because of this, irrigation became very sophisticated, right? Even the Romans had an amazing system of aqueducts and plumbing that they had created. What is irrigation? Well, you take water from a large source and usually through a series of pipes, and the pipes would get smaller and smaller into the point where you would deliver the water to each row of crops that you were growing, something like that. And when you irrigate, the water flows out of the pipes, it gets absorbed into the ground, and the plants basically absorb the water to grow. If you don't have enough water, the plants dry out. You can tell the plants aren't getting water, they're not absorbing it, and they die, they get sick. Now, when you look at human anatomy, as a person with that frame of reference, you can understand why people would look and say, well, here you have a series of pipes, right? Large arteries leading from the heart and lungs, going to smaller pipes in the arms and legs, even to smaller pipes, capillaries, and then they wash over all of the tissues, and the blood just washes in. And so they're assuming that the tissues are absorbing the blood like plants absorb water. They believe that, the food you eat is basically the raw materials that turn into blood. The blood was carried to the cells through this natural irrigation system, and the tissues absorb the blood for energy. Greek physicians talked about this. Erastistraeus and Galen of Pergamum, they both thought there was people could get sick by an overabundance of one of the four humors, one of the four liquids, blood being one, or bile, or yellow phlegm, or black phlegm. They thought that if you got overly exuberant or you were feeling ill, what you needed to do was you needed to be drained of one of these humors in order to put yourself back in balance. You have too much blood or too much of one of these other issues. And again, this makes sense from observation. When you get sick, you expel vomit, right? It's one of the body's ways of getting rid of things. Egyptians would see hippopotamuses, what they thought were rubbing themselves against rocks and ridding themselves of blood. What the hippos were actually doing was their sweat appears red at that time. But it wasn't until 1628, and I'll go into this in just a second. It wasn't until 1628 that William Harvey, a physician, discovered that blood was actually circulatory. He found the circulatory system. And how he did that was he would observe living animals that are still alive, and how the blood flowed through them. He would play with veins and notice that they had valves that would only allow blood to go one way. And he started measuring the amount of blood that would come through a human heart. And he found after half an hour, there was more blood that passed through a human heart than the body could possibly hold. So he says, well, that blood is obviously not just being pumped out because there's too much of it. It must be piped in and gone around again. So that's 1628. George Washington died in 1799. Why did Washington still believe in bloodletting? That's the question. Well, there's three main reasons that I can think of. First is it was well known. It was popular, right? It was the common go-to for many, many years. It had a 3,000-year history. Guys have been doing this for a long, long time. And all of the experts had been using it. We had it written up, right? Anyone who was in the medical field had done some of this. It was Galen of Pergamum, like I said, really established this idea. And in his writings, it spread throughout the Roman Empire. Now, it also had certain anecdotal stories of success. People saw somebody who had some bloodletting done and said, oh, and I feel much better afterwards. Okay, so it was well known, it was popular in Washington's day, and it explained things rather easily. That whole picture of watering and the idea of, backing up with, you can overwater plants, right? And you can make plants be sickly and non-productive. They lose their rigidity, things like that if you overwater them. And so Washington was a farmer. This made sense to him. It explained things in a way that he understood the world. He could see this picture in his mind's eye. And that was part of the key. Also, he had himself had some subjective responses to it. So past healings were a thing. And he believed that hey, it made me feel better before. He attributed his getting better not to the fact that maybe just give you a couple of days of rest in bed because you've been, bloodlet. Maybe that would be something better, but he attributed it to the bloodletting. Now, why do I bring all of this up? Why do I talk to you about bloodletting? What does this have to do with our question? Well, because the key here is also the piece that I want to emphasize. Your view of God will shape your understanding of the world too. And we all have starting points in how we look at things. And so who God is, how he responds to the world, these kinds of things really have a huge impact on how we understand other things. And there's a whole lot of folks who start off with a certain set of beliefs. And when they start off with that basic assumption about God or about who God is, the way God is, then all of a sudden their belief system doesn't seem as silly as what we may have believed before. Sometimes when you hear another faith tradition, it's easy to dismiss it as, how can you believe that? How can you believe in something like reincarnation? How can you believe in, a man flying on a horse from this place to this place? All those kinds of things are easy to dismiss, but I caution you, because people can say, how can you believe that a guy who was dead could rise again? How can you believe that some itinerant carpenter who lived 2,000 years ago was actual deity in flesh? How can you believe any of that stuff? Again, those kinds of things are easily dismissed unless you understand where they're coming from. So one of the things that I want to do today is to take a look at each of these positions, to see how each of these faiths understand themselves, how they reflect God or their concept of God, and see how they hold up. You see, what we want to really understand is our world, what we call a worldview. Now, a worldview is how we interpret all the things that we see in life. So it's how we suppose God, life, and the world, and all of reality works. These ideas will shape what we think is true and what is not true. And it's how we anticipate what may or should happen down the road. So there's 5 things that I want to talk about that our worldview entails. 5 different main aspects to one's worldview. The first is the idea of origins, one's understandings of where everything came from. Where did we come from? Where did the universe come from? Why are we here? Why is there anything here? That kind of idea. Every worldview has, and every belief system touches on origins. Also, your worldview has to account for the rationality of our world. How do we make sense of all of the stuff that we see around us? How can we really understand those things that have transpired, are transpiring? How can we know that what we see is true? How do we know that we're not dreaming it? We're not living in a virtual reality world or living in the Matrix or something like that. How can we trust the rationality of the world? Another thing your worldview does is it touches on your purpose. What is our purpose? Why are we here? Worldview, belief systems answer that question. Why should we exist at all? Is there a purpose for us? If that purpose is there, maybe we better get around to doing it. How do we know we can find it? Things like that. Next, our worldview should talk about or look at morality. Is there such a thing as true morality? Is morality objective? How do we know? Where do we get these things called moral laws? If we're looking for laws in the city, we can have a city penal book. We know that there is a city council who will pass laws. We know that there is a state and federal government who will pass state and federal laws. Who passes the laws for all of humanity? Are there laws for all of humanity? Are they just merely agreements among people? So your worldview will account for morality. And lastly, your worldview will account for the ultimate ends of things. Where are we heading? Where are we going? What's our final destination? So these are the 5 things our worldview entails. And in the different belief systems that we're going to look at tonight, we're going to touch on each one of these 5 points. And the reason why we do this is because these are big questions. But the key is, for any belief system to be rational, these all need to work together. Okay, I've said it before, and I say it again. There's a key idea that I really want you to understand. There's only one good reason to believe anything, and that is if it's true. If it's not true, you really shouldn't believe it, right? You can be self-deluded. That's a key piece that I've talked about over and over again. If we're going to talk about belief systems, we should only believe a belief system that is true. Now, is this begging the question? How do we know what's true? How can we tell? Do we have to jump into every belief system in order to test it out, for example? Well, no, not really. Now think about this for a minute. When you want to seek a belief system that's true, one of the things that you can do is look logically at each piece of the system, kind of like what we did for bloodletting. So, for example, every belief system that was rational, is appropriate to believe, will at least be internally coherent and externally consistent. Now, what do I mean by when I say internally coherent? I mean it will agree with itself. It won't be contradictory in itself. So, for example, if you are believing in the idea that bloodletting, there's still the 4 humors going around, but you say, I know that blood flows through at 22 pints a half hour, and I know we have 22 pints, but I still think that bloodletting will work. Well, that's an internal inconsistency. It doesn't make sense because you're contradicting yourself in there. So any time you hold a belief that's internally incoherent, you have a problem. When it contradicts itself, it's an issue. You wouldn't, now, for example, modern medicine, if you were diagnosed, say, with cancer, here's my question to you. Do you have to try every medical approach before you'll settle on the one that you would want to go full bore on? If I was diagnosed with cancer, I know I wouldn't go to the African witch doctor to have him, slaughter an animal and offer the blood to the gods. That's just not going to happen. I don't need to test that out before I say go to an oncologist and try to work through my cancer with some of the best treatments that we can find today. Doesn't mean we have all the answers. Doesn't mean that my doctor will prescribe the right diagnosis for me. But what it does mean is I can rule that one out, and I don't have to waste my time on it because I haven't tried it yet. And this is one of the points that I bring up when people ask me, well, how do you know all religions are wrong if you haven't tried them all? Well, I don't have to try them all. All I have to do is to find out whether they're, again, internally coherent and externally consistent. What do I mean by externally consistent? I mean that they have to match the way we see the world. We see evidence of how the world works. For example, the idea that people are basically good. Now, I've heard a lot of folks telling me people are basically good. I've also raised 4 children, and I never had to teach my kids how to be selfish. I always had to teach them how to share. I never had to teach them really how to lie. They figured that one out pretty quick. But I did have to teach them why lying is wrong. So I'm going to push back on the idea that maybe all people are born basically good. Probably not true. The history of humanity is replete with the horrors of people who have been left to themselves. And as my friend Clay Jones says, we are actually all wired to be Auschwitz-enabled. In other words, he studied all of the great tragedies that happened throughout humanity. And most of the people even in Nazi Germany, they were not vile people who were different than you and me. They were the average German on the street. How did they get to the point of where they were turning in Jewish neighbors and things like that? Because people have that ability in them to do so. So to say people are basically good, I have a problem with that. That's not consistent with the way I see the world. So every belief system needs to be internally coherent. It shouldn't contradict itself. If something contradicts itself, then we know it's not true. And it should be externally consistent. And that's how I want to review our worldview. So let's take our first system here. And we're going to look at, that's right, Christianity. What is Christianity's story? What is the Christian worldview? How do we understand Christianity in the main big scheme of things? Well, we start with origins, of course. In Christianity, we know that all things begin with God. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning was the Word. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1:1. God is not explained. He's not told, we're not told how he came to be. He just is. Matter of fact, some of the Hebrew scholars said that the first word in the Hebrew Bible of Genesis, Bereshit, the bet is closed on 3 sides because that's God's domain. That's something we cannot know, but creation starts with the opening out. And that was the word bet. But God is eternal. He has always existed. He's spirit. He sits outside of all time and space. Most importantly, God is one being, right? Christian is a monotheistic faith. And that's key. It came out of Judaism, which was the first monotheistic faiths. God is infinite but self-sufficient. He needs no one or nothing. He doesn't rely on his creation. He can exist perfectly well with nothing beside himself. He sits separate from his creation. He is not his creation. That's a key piece. But he is the source of all creation. So anything else that exists depends upon him. And the other key aspect is he is a personal God. He loves, he grieves, he can relate to other intelligent beings. So this is who God is. And because he is personal, he is rational. He creates with intention. He designs the world for a purpose. He plans it. He has an orderly way about it, and he wants to see it grow to fruition, to whatever his end desires are. So rationally, you can see that Christianity is anchored in a rational God. Because he has these plans, because he has these purposes, that means when he creates human beings, he has a purpose for us too. And that's a big piece of it. So Christianity teaches that God would have a purpose of creating human beings to bear his image, to know him, and to love him. That's what they seek to do. We are intrinsically valuable as creatures who hold the image of God. Now, beyond purpose then, if he values us, he also values our benefit, our good. And God is perfectly good and perfectly just. So our morality is found in him as well. He does not allow any evil to persist without ultimately being judged. In order to be perfectly good, you must love your creation. In order to be perfectly just, you must be able to deal with any evil in an appropriate way. You can't leave evil unjudged. Anyone who allows evil to go on unjudged, anyone who gives a free pass is not perfectly judged. Yet man, as I talked about a little while ago, is born into a state of self-centeredness, of sin. And this sin, therefore, separates us from the perfect God. He can't have unlimited fellowship with us because there's sin that needs to be judged. So what is the ultimate end for this? Well, it means that God knows we can't fix our self-centeredness. He knows that we're dependent upon him. But he sent Jesus to do it in our stead. And that's the key teaching of Christianity. That God understood that evil is a real thing in the world. So Christianity acknowledges evil comes even within the heart of man. We talk about the devil and the fact that there's external evil forces that play upon us. But Christianity also teaches that there's no temptation that you aren't able to overcome yet, especially as a Christian. But you are guilty if you rely upon that within yourself, because you'll never be able to do it on your own strength. So God, knowing this, knowing that we're flawed, knowing that we're cracked pots, if you will, sent his son to live that perfect life for us. And by him, he was able to judge sin, take our sin upon himself, judge that. And from there, then, we are able to come once again into fellowship with God. That's the Christian story. That's the way Christianity understands God, understands our relation to God. We have an ultimate end. Ultimately, the idea is that those who accept this gift that God has given us through his son will be able to once again enjoy fellowship with their Creator throughout all eternity. And that's a wonderful plan, a wonderful story. It also fits together so well. You can see that if God is the ultimate origin of all things, it follows that God is the one who created the universe in an orderly way, which makes him rational. His rationality gives him a plan and a purpose. So therefore, we have a purpose to our lives. Our purpose, therefore, leads to a moral aspect to who we are and how we should treat one another, which ultimately leads to the need for a Savior to accomplish the ultimate goal that God started at the beginning of creation. And this makes sense to me. This, I think, is, something that really makes sense. So let's run this story of Christianity through the belief system test. Remember what I said before, that what we want to see is we want to see whether these things are internally coherent and externally consistent with what we know about the world. So first of all, is Christianity internally coherent? Well, yeah, I believe it is. First of all, God is described as a spirit. Now, why is that important? Or Jesus in John 4:24, God is spirit. Those that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. Well, that's important because if God was anything other than spirit, it really wouldn't explain the rest of the universe. Remember, one of the things that we're trying to explain is the creation of all matter, energy, space, and time. Where are all those things coming from, right? So if God is material, well, you're not explaining matter because you've already got matter. If God is a being that has always been kind of confined by a time frame, well, then you've not explained time. If God is a physical being that takes up space, you've not explained space. These are but God is spirit. He is mind. He can be outside of all matter, energy, space, and time. It's only when he wills creation, when he speaks, the Bible uses that terminology, that creation actually happens. He's also personal, as I mentioned before. Because he's personal, then he can choose at a specific point to say, let creation begin. And creation begins. The clock starts running. So a mind who's personal can make a choice to start creating. And this is a big thing when we talk about Christianity, God is triune. Now, why is that important? And this is something that's unique to the Christian position. Well, the Trinity actually solves a lot of problems. Remember, one of the things that I said earlier on was that God is self-sufficient. He needs no one or nothing. We know that God is love, right? We're told that in Scripture as well. Well, if God is love, before he created human beings, what was there to love? That's a big question. Now, let's think about this for a minute. You have, as C.S. Lewis says, in any relationship, you have the lover, you have the one that's beloved, and then you have the love that is between them, these three things. If there's no one else existing, can God show love? Well, if he's a monad, if he's even a strict unity, no, he can't show love to anything else. There's nothing else to love. There's no thing out there to reflect upon. But if he's a triune being, if he's a single being that has three centers of consciousness, Father, Son, and the Spirit, three persons within that main being, then what he can do is he can show a relational value between the three persons of the Trinity. And it works. Only in Christianity do you have this idea of a unity in diversity, the idea that the three are one. And while it's a difficult situation to understand, it really makes sense. Now, I want to stress to you the uniqueness of these ideas. Really, monotheism is something that's really unique in the ancient religious landscape. Islam, of course, and Christianity both were influenced on this from Judaism, but Judaism is where the Old Testament gets it. When we look at the scriptures, Christianity I see as the natural outcome or the natural outgrowth of Judaism. It's the logical conclusion that Judaism would lead to. But this is just a very different kind of concept than we see in other faiths all across the world, from North America, South America, the African continent, the Aboriginals in Australia and the South Pacific, through Japan, the Far East, the Middle East. It is truly something unique. And of course, being triune is kind of takes it one step further. But so does that mean the big point on all of this is it's different, but what that difference does is it makes it coherent. It makes it all work together. And that's a big piece. So is Christianity internally coherent? Yeah, I believe so. Are there problems in us understanding the Trinity? Well, maybe it's a little difficult to understand it, but just because we can't fully comprehend it doesn't mean that it's logically incongruent. I don't fully comprehend my television, but it's not logically incongruent. No one fully comprehends quantum physics, but they don't reject the theory out of hand because it makes too many predictions that are real. So just because we can't fully comprehend something doesn't mean it's not true. It means that we have limited knowledge on our side, which again is consistent with what we would believe God to be. We would expect a God, if he is God, to be beyond our explanation. Any God that's as small as one you can fully explain is really no God for you to worship, because he's just like you. So, is Christianity externally consistent? Yes, we would expect a God. We desire a God. Someone who we would worship should be wholly good and wholly just, right? The problem of evil is a real issue. We grieve at evil that we see. Maybe not even evil done to us. Maybe sometimes we see evil done to others. Christianity offers a grounding for good in the nature of God and a way to reconcile the sinfulness of human beings with God's purity. So here we see the idea that God is wholly good, wholly just, and yet can still deal with man who's fatally flawed in a way that redeems him, and God's ultimate ends and purposes are not thwarted. Also, Christianity explains what we see in creation. And this is true of Judaism as well. The idea that the universe is contingent. We know this. We know the universe has a beginning. At some point in the past, the universe was not here, right? We know this because it's like a clock. We know the clock is running down. The second law of thermodynamics. We know that everything goes from order to disorder. So we know that the clock's running down. We know that we're running out of energy. We know all of these things. We also know that there's an incredible design to the universe. The anthropic principle, as Barrow and Tipler in their marvelous book in the 1980s, Cosmological Anthropic Principle, laid out. And these were two great scientists. They were not necessarily believers. They were just people, good astronomers, showing how over and over again the universe shows an incredible degree of design in how it's put together. And that's why it explains creation well. It also grounds reason, because we trust a rational God to create a rational universe. In fact, it is because the people, the medievals, and then those in the Enlightenment, believed that a God of Christianity would never create something in disarray or in ways that wouldn't make logical sense, that they said we can find out and learn God's thoughts after him. Our basis for modern science comes from this idea that creation acts in law-like manners because God is an orderly God, and he wouldn't have things just popping into existence for no reason, right? We would understand that when we get up tomorrow, gravity's going to pull the same way. There's still going to be third-dimensional space for us to walk in, things like that. So we see that Christianity holds it's internally coherent and it's externally consistent in the world. Okay, well, that's Christianity. What's the next belief system that we want to look at? Well, I thought we'd at least touch on one of the belief systems that was most popular throughout most of human history in individual nation states, tribes, and that is polytheism. Polytheism, the idea that there are multiple gods, right? Now, polytheism can be anything from the Native American beliefs in different animal type gods, all the way to the Greek gods, as you see in the slide. So, what's the story of polytheism? Well, usually, and I'm going to summarize broadly, but there are some common denominators in all of these. The gods that people worship were either birthed from other gods, they were birthed from maybe the Titans in Greek mythology, or from these initial eternal beings, the sky people, as some of the Native Americans believed in them. Many tribal creation stories talk about a pre-existing planet like our own, where there was an island, or there was a group of people, and someone either fell to the earth that we know. Usually the earth in most of these stories was a watery destination, and then either a turtle brings up some mud and it starts to grow into land, or the water starts to recede and land starts to appear, and things like this. But over and over again, the origin story is gods birthed other gods, and then certain gods, like the Olympians, would overthrow the Titans, and they would become the ruling gods and things of that nature. Now, a lot of polytheistic faiths do believe in some kind of a high god, but he seems to be very silent, very much put away, very much part of the background, if you will, not much to do with humanity. So he's not necessarily the one they worship. They will go build temples to Zeus or Apollo or something like that. Usually there's no intrinsic rationality given to these gods apart from human reason. If you've read any of the Greek myths, you can see that really what they're trading on is basically people, just like you and me, who argue, who get jealous, who do bad things, things like that. And they believe that we as human beings are simply products of our ancestors, and our ancestors were ultimately the gods like this. Many times the gods can be wrong. They can be emotional, right? And they can react in that way, sending storms and things like that, because they're in a fight with their deity husband or something like that. Now, what's the purpose of the polytheist? How does he understand man's purpose in the life? Well, the purpose really is to just please the gods so that you can get a blessing. It's a self-serving purpose. You want victory in war, you pay to the war god. You want growing good crops, you pay to the fertility god. You want a new child, you pray to the god of love. These kinds of things. Or perhaps you just try to keep a low profile and stay out of the way. You do your due service to whatever god the city invokes as a good citizen, and you just try and keep your mouth shut so that they don't notice you. Normally, in these kinds of things, in terms of morality, there is usually a wrestling between good and bad gods. But morality is assumed. It's when Zeus is cheating on Hera, but it's the god who's doing the cheating. And what's the ultimate ends? Well, you have a final destination off to Valhalla, or your soul will be held in Hades, or things like that. So when we look at polytheism, when we understand this, how does it pass the worldview test? First of all, is it internally coherent? Well, no. And here's the reason why. Multiple gods cannot be God. Anytime you have more than one God, then the concept of God is really undermined, because those gods aren't perfect, which means that they're contingent themselves. We said that the universe was contingent in Christianity. In polytheism, the gods themselves are contingent. They got their start from somebody else, who got their start from somebody else. And here's the argument that you can see. Premise one: if anyone is not the author of every aspect of creation, then his authority is insufficient to rationally guarantee the behavior of creation itself. Under polytheism, there is no one God who is the author of every aspect of creation. Therefore, under polytheism, no one has the authority to rationally guarantee the behavior of that creation, including that high God. So, anytime you have multiple gods, you have a problem with the idea of God at all. There's no buck stops here authority, so to speak. And you have a problem with morality. How in the world do we know what's right and wrong? If the gods are acting like, lecherous men or vile people, things like that, then how in the world can you say that's the right thing or the wrong thing to do? If the gods can't model it, if the gods are evil, then where do you get this idea of evil from? What, again, is the law book you're looking from? So I don't see how the gods can hold to these ideas and still be internally coherent. It seems like You can't call them gods if they're immoral. That doesn't make sense to me at all. Also, are they externally consistent? Well, again, no. The origin stories don't explain the origin of the universe. There's always something before something else. All the gods themselves live in space, seem to have some kind of a material existence to them, things like that. And the gods of Olympus or the animal gods of native Africa or Native American tribes are really just larger personifications of ourselves. And the stories themselves are just fantastical. You can go to Olympus. There's no one there. It doesn't make sense to say that the gods are there. Really, what we see are gods acting in ways that are just like people with superpowers used, and many times they've just done this to explain natural phenomena. Now, this is the problem with even dualistic faiths that you see, such as Zoroastrianism and things like that, as well as polytheistic faiths. So that's one key. But what if there's another way to go about it? What if we talk about the idea that there is no personal God at all? What if we just get rid of that? So let's take a look at the Eastern faiths, including Hinduism, Vedanta Buddhism, things like that. What is their story? This is what we would call pantheistic monism, where there isn't a personal God at all, but all is God. And that's really where the origin story begins. In this tradition, all is one, the Brahman, right? And all is completely impersonable, indistinguishable. Just that's why they call it a monad, a monism. It is just itself. It has no key features other than it is the whole. So it's completely impersonal, and man, because it's part of the whole, himself is divine. So we are all divine. All other existence is divine. It's not just human beings. There was a big, very famous book and movie in the 1970s, Jonathan Livingston Seagull, where it goes through this, the idea that he gets this enlightenment, that he's more than just a seagull. He's one with the universe, so to speak. In these faiths, our individuality is an illusion. It carries us further away from our true reality, which is the oneness of the universe. And really our ultimate end then is to achieve what would be labeled nirvana. The idea of being back absorbed into the whole. The Hindus would say it's like you're a drop of water. And when that drop of water falls into the sea, it no longer retains its individuality. It just becomes one with the entire sea. If you're in the Buddhist tradition, the idea is a little bit different. As opposed to being one with the everything, you're one with the nothing. So the idea of enlightenment in the Buddhist tradition is you are to be like a candle that has been blown out. That's the concept. So each life is supposed to be absorbed back into the whole, but it's not easy to do because we tend to believe this individuality. So our souls are reincarnated myriads of times until it achieves that state of enlightenment and does not have to go through the cycle of birth and death any longer. Now, how do we understand the rationality of the Eastern system? Well, that's the key. See, because rationality makes distinctions. The idea of reason is that you can put two things together and compare and contrast them. This is different from that. And in the Eastern view, that's where the problems start. So you must meditate. You must lose all illusions of distinction, right? You hear these things like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Or you need to think about one end, what is a rope with one end? Things of this nature. The idea that in order to truly gain enlightenment and understand yourself, that you are just one aspect of the larger whole, and the more that you lose those individual aspects of yourself, the better or the closer you come to the whole, means that you must go beyond rationality, is the way they would put it. All Atman, all creation, is Brahman, is the one. For morality, the law of karma is key. The law of karma governs how one will be brought back in one state. Now, it's not the Western concept of karma that if you do something today, maybe in a year from now, you're going to get it returned to you. No, karma in the East and the proper understanding of karma is that if you do something bad today, you will have to pay for it in your next life. It's going to cost you by being born into a lower system or a lower state than you are today. And that means that people who can do really bad things and come back as a dung beetle or something like that. So, in the Eastern system then, what can we understand about in terms of the belief system test? Is it internally coherent? Well, I think that's pretty obvious that it's not. Why? Well, there's two problems, really. If we're starting with an undividuated whole, right? A complete whole of no distinction whatsoever, then how did the distinctions come out to begin with? What separated it? If that's the perfection, what external force caused it to be imperfect? If it's an external force, then there's something other than the undividuated whole. If it's an internal force, then it's not perfect even in and of itself. So you have a contradiction either way in this idea. To say that this has come to be and that's the perfection that we seek, you have to say, well, wait a minute, how did it happen in the beginning? Secondly, when you start saying you've got to rise above your rationality, you've got to stop making distinctions in order to achieve nirvana, well, aren't you making a distinction there? Aren't you contradicting the very concept that you're trying to teach by making a distinction? You see, by making distinctions between the imperfect and the perfect, between making the distinctions between nirvana and falling short of it, between making the distinctions between being enlightened and not enlightened, you're reinforcing the idea that distinctions are real and not illusory, but you're teaching that distinctions are illusory. This is why the Eastern system is hopelessly muddled, because it can never escape the fact that it's rational. It shuns rationality for the sake of others, yet it leans on rationality to sell itself in that regard. So, is it internally coherent? No. It contradicts itself, I think, in every turn. Is it externally consistent? Well, I don't think it's externally consistent either. Take the law of karma. Nothing can break this law of karma, but who or what is that judge? Who or what saw you pick up the spare change that should have gone to the shopper before you and said, I'm going to keep that, and takes an account of that and says that in the next life you're going to be a little bit poorer because of it? Who or what's keeping that tally? What is their rule book that they're relying upon? Seems to me that the idea of a law of good and evil that doesn't exist, that exists outside of a personal God, you have to say, well, where did that come from? And who's the one that's the scorekeeper that's judging these kinds of things? See, also, the idea that evil is illusory. If all is illusory, the Eastern faiths teach that evil is one of those illusions. But evil is real. We know this to be true. We feel it. We've suffered. There's real suffering going on. And to just dismiss evil is not a solution to the problem of evil. Matter of fact, it makes the problem of evil worse. If you were to come to a suffering parent whose child was diagnosed with a terminal illness and say, well, that's okay, it's not real, it's just illusory, you can imagine the response you'd get. No, it doesn't make sense. Lastly, the East's impoverishment is a key piece. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, think about it. Hinduism has been practiced for well over 3,000 years in India. Buddhism for 2,500 years in China and Tibet and places of that nature. If these were practices that were leading to enlightenment, then the law of rebirth should say that those individuals would get better. Their status in life would get better. Matter of fact, they should be the most advanced civilizations, the happiest, the least crushed by poverty, the least crushed by misery in the planet. because they've had that much longer to become enlightened than, say, the West. Do we see that? Do we see the fruits of that system working out in the East? Unfortunately, we do not. We see things like the caste system in the East, where people are shunned and they suffer because they're born into a lower state that others believe, well, the reason why you were born that way is because you must have done something evil in a previous life. Karma is a cruel taskmaster. It forces you to pay a penalty for a crime that you can't remember, one that you'll never be able to make up for, and one that you can never appeal to a judge. It's awful. So, how does the Far East measure up in their belief systems? No, I don't believe they're internally coherent nor externally consistent. Okay, so let's take a look at one more quick idea, and then we'll talk about wrapping it up, and I'll take some questions from you as well. We do have the YouTube chat, by the way, is available if you're on the YouTube channel right now. The chat is available for you to ask questions, and we have a phone number. If you're not able to use the YouTube chat, you can text your questions in to 951-732-8631, and I'm going to show that number as we get closer to the end. 951-732-8631. But lastly, naturalism. What's the story on naturalism? Well, the origin of idea is simple. It's that the universe is one of an infinite number of other universes that are eternally being created out of quantum foam or something to that effect. Only the natural exists, though. There is no supernatural, and all things obey the laws of the universe. Now, what's our purpose in this? Well, we're simply products of the laws and the initial conditions of the universe. We're an accident, really. And if you were to run the videotape of our evolution back and ran it over again, we'd most likely evolve into something quite different. We'd look and be very different if we even would exist at all. We don't know that. Therefore, we're nothing more, and we're not intrinsically valuable than anything else. We're just another fixture in the material universe. Now, some who are naturalists would say that there is value to us because we can reason. The problem is, and they hold to reason, they believe reason is necessary for knowledge, but they don't have any way of understanding why our reason should be trusted. They have no grounding for that. Do we trust the reasoning of a monkey? You know, I wouldn't trust the reasoning of a monkey. I would, call into question. My dog does things because it's instinctual for her to do things, not because she's weighed it out in her head and measured the ramifications. And this is the problem. And now, many in the naturalist camp hold science in very high regard. Sometimes science is the only form of knowledge that they would grant as factual. But of course, that's a problem in and of itself. How do they understand morality? Well, morality is just rooted in ourselves. It's either, as a utilitarian would put, what makes us happy, or it's a social construct, or it's an individual choice. There is no, if there is an absolute morality that we all must adhere to, there is nothing out there that's setting that absolute morality. It's just something we all kind of know. And what are our ultimate ends? Well, it's easy. We die and cease to be, and the universe will as well. And that's pretty much it. So, in looking at naturalism, what can we know from that? Is it internally coherent? Well, no, not really. See, how do you get a something from a nothing? And this is the biggest problem that the naturalists have, is they start with a nothing and they get a something. A nothing by itself is a no thing. There's nothing there. You can't even say quantum foam or a quantum vacuum, because those are things. They have attributes. They have potentialities, right? An acorn isn't a non-thing. It's not a tree, but it's not a non-thing. There's something else to it. There's a potential for a tree there. And quantum states, I mean, think about it. You have things that are popping in and out of existence, supposedly, in a quantum vacuum. Okay, well, if they're popping in and out of existence, that means two things. First of all, there's a before and there's an after. So that means that time is already talking about, and they're popping in and out in something, space, and they're generating energy. So you're now talking about, three of the four aspects of reality that we're trying to already explain by positing a quantum vacuum. So a quantum vacuum is not nothing. It's something, and you can't get a something from a nothing. If you have a nothing, there's nothing there. Secondly, there's no way for the naturalist to ground his moral duties and obligations if there is no lawgiver that transcends humanity. So if we are the ultimate choices of what's right and wrong, then what we'll find is that really we're talking about opinion and what we desire, not necessarily what's duty bound for us. So it may be, some people may desire health, some people may desire the propagation of the species, others may not. But there's no way to ground that morality. There's no way to make that morality something that says, even if you disagree with it, you have to abide by it because there's an authority that sits higher than humanity telling you to. That doesn't exist. So there's no way that morality can be real if we're just an accidental construct of chemicals. Any accidental construct of chemicals isn't right or wrong. It just is. But people know morality is true, right? We know that killing babies for fun is wrong. So we have a contradiction there. So I don't believe that naturalism is internally coherent, and I don't believe it's externally consistent. Again, those that rely on science as the form of knowledge know that science is replete with errors. Matter of fact, the entire history of science is something that is one person correcting the errors of the science before it. I mean, think about it. Would you want a doctor giving you open heart surgery on a book that was written on hearts in 1910? Of course not. There's a lot more. Even in 1960, we want something that has the best information, the latest data, correcting the errors of past mistakes. And atheism and naturalism really do nothing about the problem of evil. Nature is just red in tooth and claw, and that's just the way it is. And some people are fit for survival and others aren't. And again, is that what you want your chaplain to walk into the hospital to tell the parents of the sick child? Well, I guess she just wasn't fit enough to survive, but that's okay. You might be able to have another one whose genes can then propagate to the next generation. That doesn't seem appropriate to me. It really is, this whole idea is silent on the origin of design in the universe. It doesn't make any sense. The origin of life. How do you get something from living from non-living materials? The origin of consciousness. How did consciousness arise from non-thinking matter? It can't ground reason. It can't ground beauty. There's no way for us to understand any of those things. So when we look at all of these different belief systems, when we look at all these other faiths and understandings, what we find is they really don't stack up too well. Now, I know I've left a couple out, Islam especially. I'm reserving that one because we're going to do an entire talk on Islam by itself, so I'm going to hold that in reserve. But one of the things I did want to do was I wanted to talk to you about one other aspect that you might be able to be interested in, and that's this question. What about Jesus? Now, what do I mean when I say, what about Jesus? Well, here's an interesting thing. It seems that most of the world faith systems really have Jesus somewhere in their system. He's either an enlightened yogi in certain systems or someone who's achieved enlightenment. He's a prophet in Islam. He has one of the biggest even the New Age movement. He's an avatar. And you get all of these people who are trying to claim Jesus as part of their faith tradition. Well, here's my question. Why do all faiths want a piece of Jesus? What is it about Jesus that makes him so special? And if all faith traditions want to claim a piece of Jesus, then doesn't it make sense to at least start your faith exploration with the religion that has Jesus smack dab in the middle of it, which is Christianity? If Jesus is to be revered, then it seems that what we should be doing is to follow his teachings first and foremost. And that's the key. And what you do is if you follow the teachings of Jesus as laid out in the New Testament, then you find that you're talking about Christianity again. Leads you right back to that place. Okay. So that's the basic understanding of these different worldviews. There's a lot I could have covered, just didn't really have the time of it. I did want to let you know that if you wanted to get in touch with me, you can do that as well. There's, of course, the website, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, other places like that you can get in touch with me. Please feel free to do that. But I also wanted to leave some time to take questions and see if there's some folks out there. So I'm going to pull this screen up here. And what I'd like to ask you to do again is if you have questions, please drop them in the box there. And let's see. Okay, so our first question is coming from Ruben, and I don't know why it's not showing up on the. I see your name, Ruben, but the question itself isn't showing up. I'll tell it here. It says, "Is God metaphysical or transcendent?" Is Ruben's question. I'm not quite sure what difference you had in mind there, but let me at least talk about it a little bit and make sure I have both of these things up so I can see them. There you go. I'm sorry. I'm working multiple screens today. God, when you say metaphysical, the idea of metaphysical is broadly, in a philosophic term, metaphysical deals with truth. Is God real? Does metaphysics does he actually exist, or is he illusory? When you say transcendent means that he sits on a level, on a plane that is higher than human beings. So yes, God transcends his creation. He's bigger than his creation. He's not merely his creation. He can hold the world in his hand, if you will. He's transcendent. But his metaphysical reality is there as well. He is metaphysically true. So yes, he is metaphysical and transcendent at the same time. And if that's not what you meant, please, write another question and let me know, and I'd love to talk to you more about it. So also, again, don't forget that you can text your questions into 732-8631. You see the number right there on the top of your screen. And I'd love to take those questions as well. Like I said, I know that there's a lot of ground that we covered in all of this, and it can be daunting sometime to deal with it. So are there any other questions that you guys would like to ask? I'll give you a couple more minutes. Okay. Well, I wanted to thank everyone for showing up. I'm really glad that you all came out. I'm really excited for this new series that we're doing. Again, this is Christianity in the Hot Seat that you've been joining me with. Thank you so much for being here. One of the key pieces next week will be dealing with what we call the question of transgenderism. And that ought to be a very interesting topic. It's something that everyone's been talking about today, and it's important for us to really understand it, be able to answer it appropriately, be able to witness appropriately, not only to those who are feeling confused on their gender, but even third parties, again, as it's become much of the public discussion. I've really enjoyed our time together. Next time I'll remember to have the mic on. And again, if you haven't signed up for the class, this will only be up on the YouTube site for just a few days, and then I'm going to put it in the archive. But you can get the archive with the notes, with the PowerPoint slides, and watch all of the series if you're not able to join us on the live feed at that time as well. So I really recommend that. Just your name and your email address. That's all it takes. Go to comereason.org/dare to defend and sign up there. Until then, we will see you again.